The shriek of the bolt cutters was the loudest sound Arthur Vance had made in a month. It echoed flatly in the corrugated metal hallway, a sound of final, desperate failure. The single fluorescent bulb overhead, coated in dust, flickered, casting their shadows long and wavering on the roll-up door. He put his shoulder to the heavy, rattling metal of Unit 14B, and the smell of 20 years of dust, mildew, and forgotten things rolled out, a physical presence that choked him. He'd just spent $480, every last cent from the biscuit tin, the money for the hydro and the gas and Ellie's prescription, on a blind auction for a 10 by 20 box of what was, immediately and obviously, garbage. He felt the blood drain from his face, a cold rush that left him dizzy. Beside him, Ellie let out a small, papery cough, a sound that had become the soundtrack to his dread. It was the cough that said the cheaper, generic pills weren't working. "Oh, Arthur," she whispered, her gloved hand finding his. It was thin and frail, even through the wool. He couldn't look at her. He'd done it. He'd failed. Again. He'd dragged them to this freezing auction yard at dawn, fueled by a desperate, stupid hope, a rumor of a Millionaire's unit, and had bet their entire existence on a rusted lock. The unit was packed to the ceiling with yellowing office boxes, their lids concave with damp, their sides burst open in places, spilling what looked like sodden paper. A set of cracked leather chairs, their stuffing erupting like dry wounds, lay piled in a corner. And towering stacks of something, all shrouded in heavy plastic tarps, gray with grime. It was a bust. A total, life-ruining bust. The $480 wasn't just money, it was their last shred of dignity. It was the buffer between them and the street. Maybe in the back," Ellie said, her voice trying for a hope she didn't feel. Arthur said nothing. He tugged at the first tarp, brittle with age. It split apart with a sound like a dry sob, revealing a wall of bankers' boxes, their labels pulped and unreadable, their sides water-stained and sagging. Useless. He moved deeper, his breath fogging in the cold, damp air, pushing past a heavy oak desk that someone had, inexplicably, stored on its side. It was a beautiful piece, or had been. Now its legs were dark with water damage. He saw, with a carpenter's eye, the ruin of good marquetry. "It's all paper, Arthur. Just office trash," Ellie said, her hand at her mouth. He kept moving, driven by a dull, self-hating rage. He had to see the full extent of his stupidity. In the very back, almost hidden by a stack of collapsed shelving, sat a single, strange object. It wasn't a box. It was a case. It was made of riveted aluminum, sleek and seamless, like something from an old airplane or a science fiction film. It was modern, clean, and utterly out of place in this crypt of mildew. It was sealed, not with a padlock, but with two industrial lever-action clasps. Arthur knelt, his knees cracking in protest against the cold concrete. He wiped the thick grime from a small engraved placard. His eyes, weak in the gloom, struggled to focus. He squinted, tracing the letters with a dirty fingernail. He read the words, and his heart didn't just stop. It felt like it inverted, like it fell right out of his chest. Property of J. Crest. Do not open until January 1, 2050. Wait, before you see what's inside. If this story already has your heart pounding, tell us where you're watching from. When forgotten boxes open, when second chances hide under dust and debt, subscribe and stay close. You'll never guess what's been left behind. Now, back to the lock clicking open. Arthur read the placard again and again. The words didn't change. They stared back at him, impassive and absolute. 2050? His voice was a raw croak. He pushed himself up, his hand flat against the cold metal. 25 years, Ellie. It's a joke. It's a rich man's joke. Ellie moved beside him, her small frame wrapped in a coat 2 sizes too large, a donation from the church drive. She placed her gloved fingers on the cold metal, tracing the letters as he had. "My," was all she said. The word was a breath, a small cloud in the frigid air. "It's definite, isn't it?" "It's an insult," Arthur spat, standing too fast. His back seized, a familiar hot pain, but it was nothing compared to the cold, liquid panic in his stomach. $480 for a joke, a prank, left to rot by a man who had too much of everything. The rumors that had flown around the auction yard, that this unit belonged to a vanished millionaire, a tech recluse named Julian Crest, had been true. And this was his final, cruel laugh at the poor suckers who would one day buy his trash. "What do we do, Arthur?" Ellie asked, her eyes fixed on the date, her mind clearly calculating. 25 years. They'd be ghosts. "Do?" Arthur kicked one of the sagging banker's boxes. It split, spilling a cascade of sodden files and rusty paper clips. "We do nothing. We can't do anything. It's a time capsule. It's locked. It says not to open it. It's someone else's property." "It's our property now, Arthur," she said quietly. "Then it's useless property," he shot back. "We sell the desk, maybe get $50 for it if we're lucky. The chairs are junk. The rest?" He waved a trembling hand at the wall of rotting cardboard. "Landfill. We'll have to pay to dump it. We've probably lost money." "Not the case, though," Ellie said softly. It wasn't a question. "Especially the case. What good is it? It's a paperweight for 25 years. I'll be 95, Ellie. You'll be 93. If we're lucky. If this cold doesn't take you first." The words were cruel, and he regretted them as soon as they left his mouth. But his fear was a wild animal. No, he grabbed the handle. It was heavy, shockingly heavy. "I'll take it to scrap. Aluminum's high. Maybe get another $20–30. "No." Arthur stopped, his hand on the handle. Ellie rarely used that tone, not with him. Her voice, usually as soft as old cotton, had a sudden, thin thread of steel. It was the voice she'd used with the doctors, the bill collectors, the funeral director. "Arthur, no, we can't." "Can't what?" "Ellie, we have $17.14 in the bank. The eviction notice is on the fridge. It's not a suggestion, it's a final warning. It's pink. They don't send pink ones twice. There's no can't, there's only must." "It's someone's wish," she said, her hand still on the case, protective. "It's a message. You don't scrap a message. You don't throw away a promise, even if it isn't yours." "It's not our promise," he yelled, the sound deadened by the piles of junk, by the sheer sodden weight of the past. "It's the promise of a man who didn't pay his storage bill. That makes it our property. The auctioneer said so. Sold as is, where is. And it's worthless." He was breathing hard, the familiar, bitter taste of failure coating his tongue. He looked at his wife. Her face, so pale and etched with worry lines that seemed to have doubled in the last year, was set in a look of profound, unshakable stubbornness. She was staring at the case as if it were a sleeping child, something to be guarded. This was how their life had unraveled, a series of small, impossible choices. It had started with their son, Michael. 20 years gone, but the financial hole he'd left had never been filled. The experimental treatments, the specialists in cities they couldn't afford, the second mortgage they'd taken out when the insurance ran dry. They'd lost the house 5 years after they lost him. Then Arthur's carpentry business, his pride, folded. His hands, gnarled with arthritis, could no longer hold the chisel steady. His bespoke cabinets and dovetailed joints replaced by cheap particle board from overseas. Then the pension fund dissolved. stolen by men in suits he'd never meet. Now it was this, a freezing storage unit, a pile of mold, and a futuristic box that might as well have been a ticking bomb. "Fine," Arthur said, his voice flat. He was too tired to fight, too tired for anything. "We take it home. We take it all home. But it doesn't pay the hydro, Ellie. It doesn't put food on the table." It took them 3 hours. They rented a U-Haul pickup they couldn't afford, adding another $89.95 to their mountain of debt. The young man at the counter had looked at Arthur's frayed cuffs and worn-out boots with a pity that felt like a slap. Arthur's back screamed as they wrestled the desk, which he now saw was solid mahogany, not oak, and the 2 leather chairs. The chairs were cracked, yes, but he recognized the maker's mark under the grime. Eames, real ones. Even ruined, they were worth something. This sparked a tiny, treacherous ember of hope. The banker's boxes were mostly pulp, but Arthur, with a grim sense of duty, grabbed a half-dozen from the top that felt dry. "Financials," he muttered, seeing the labels. "Orion Properties, 1990 to 2005. Probably useless tax records, but he was in too deep to leave anything. Last, they loaded the aluminum case. It took both of them, grunting and sliding it onto the truck bed. It sat in the middle of the scratched, dented metal, gleaming dully in the weak afternoon sun, looking like a piece of alien technology that had fallen into their broken-down lives. The drive to their apartment was silent, the case rattling with every pothole, a hollow, mocking sound. Their apartment was on the 3rd floor of a walk-up. The building smelled of boiled cabbage and damp, a permanent fog of poverty. Getting the case up the narrow, dimly lit stairs was a nightmare. Arthur's knuckles were bloody by the time they slid it onto the worn floral carpet of their living room. It dominated the space. Their tiny apartment, a living room that was also a dining room, a kitchenette, and a bedroom down the hall, was suddenly shrunk, crowded out by this gleaming, silent object. Their lives, their worn furniture, their framed photos of Michael, all seemed to recede, to become drabber and smaller in its presence. Ellie put the eviction notice, pink, stark, on top of it as if presenting it to a visiting dignitary. "Well," she said, "there it is." Arthur collapsed into his recliner, the springs groaning in protest. He stared at the case. Open in 2050. It felt like a curse. He spent the rest of the day on the phone, his voice growing hoarse, trying to sell the desk. The best offer he got was $150. "It's mahogany," he argued to a man with a bored, slick voice. "Solid, dovetail joints, hand-planed. It's a mid-century piece." "Listen, Pop, I gotta refinish it. It's got water damage on the legs. It's gonna cost me. $150, cash. Take it or leave it." He took it. The Eames chairs, he learned from a vintage dealer, were too far gone. "The shells are good, but the leather's shot," the woman said, not unkindly. $50 for the parts, for both." He hung up, the silence of the apartment pressing in. $200. After the truck rental and the unit cost, they were still $370 in the hole. And the rent, the $650 they did not have, was due in 3 days. Ellie was in the kitchenette, humming. It was a nervous, thin sound, the tune of a song he hadn't heard her hum since Michael was small. She was making soup, splitting their last can of tomato, watering it down to make it last 2 nights. She was reusing a tea bag, her movements small and precise. The watery smell just made Arthur's stomach clench. He walked over to the case. He tapped it. Solid. He ran his hand over the placard. J. Crest. "Julian Crest," he said aloud. "What's that, dear?" Ellie called, not looking up from the pot. "The Millionaire. The man who owned it. That's what the auctioneer said they called him." The Hermit of Silicon Valley. Arthur grabbed his coat, the one with the torn lining. "I'm going to the library." "It's snowing, Arthur. Hard." I need to know. I need to know who did this to us." He walked the 2 miles to the public library, the wet snow soaking through the holes in his boots, the soles flapping. He could feel the sting of the freezing pavement. The warmth of the library was a shock, and he felt a flush of shame at his damp, ragged appearance as he passed the circulation desk. He sat at a computer terminal, his fingers stiff and cold, and typed the name. The story unfolded in a series of breathless, almost forgotten articles from 10, 15, 20 years ago. Julian Crest, a software pioneer, a certified genius. He designed a revolutionary piece of code in the late 90s, some kind of security protocol that, according to the articles, still powered most of the internet's infrastructure. He'd become a billionaire before he was 30. And then, 10 years ago, he had vanished. The stories became vague, speculative, a personal tragedy, a bitter divorce, a child. He liquidated most of his public assets, retreated into a private compound in the Pacific Northwest, and hadn't been seen since. Orion Properties was the name of his holding company. "He's not dead," Arthur muttered, leaning closer to the screen. "He's just gone." He scrolled through images. A young, intense man with dark, burning eyes and an unkempt beard staring defiantly at the camera from a 1990s tech convention. A later picture showed him in a sleek suit, his face shuttered, haunted. Then Arthur found a smaller, more recent article from a tech blog. It was speculative, a "Where Are They Now" piece from 3 years ago. It mentioned a daughter. Lila Crest, the article read, the billionaire's only child, subject of a brutal, protracted custody battle, was taken by her mother to Europe. Crest spent decades and a fortune trying to find her, with no success. Friends speculate his withdrawal from public life was a direct result of this loss. He simply gave up. Arthur stared at the screen. A lost daughter. He walked home, the snow now falling thick and fast. The world was white and silent. His anger at the rich man had faded, replaced by a hollow, familiar ache. He thought about Michael. He thought about the small, carved wooden box they'd buried with him, filled with his favorite things, a Hot Wheels car, a picture of their dog, a lucky marble, a time capsule of their own, a message to a child who would never get it. When he got back to the apartment, Ellie was asleep in the recliner, a blanket pulled up to her chin. Her breathing was shallow, a faint wheeze in the quiet room. The case sat in the middle of the floor, monolithic, a silent repository of secrets. A message to his daughter. Arthur looked at the eviction notice, still sitting on the case. He looked at his sleeping wife, her face pale, her hair a thin white mist against the dark green fabric of the chair. He walked to his toolbox, a heavy steel chest he hadn't opened in months, a relic from his old life. The hinges creaked. The smell of oil and metal, the smell of work and purpose hit him. He pulled out a pry bar. "Arthur?" Ellie was awake, her eyes wide with sleep and fear. "I'm just looking at it," he said, his voice rough. He ran the metal tip of the pry bar along the seam of the case. It was sealed tight, aerospace grade. No simple lock. Those clasps were just for show. The real seal was underneath. "Please, don't," she whispered. "Arthur, please." "Ellie, there could be anything in there. Money, bonds, gold, things that could help us, right now. Not in 2050, his voice cracked. Things that could help you, get you to a real doctor. "And what if it's just letters?" she said, sitting up. The blanket fell away. "What if it's photographs? What if it's his whole heart poured out for his little girl, and we crack it open like thieves?" "Like grave robbers?" "We are thieves, Ellie. We bought it. It's ours. The law says so. We're just stealing from ourselves." But his voice lacked conviction. "The law is wrong then," she said, and her voice was so clear, so certain, it stopped him cold. We We know what it is to lose a child. We know what it is to want just one more word, to leave one more message. Remember Michael's box, Arthur? Remember how you carved his name on the lid? What if someone had dug that up and sold the marble? Arthur dropped the pry bar. It hit the worn carpet with a dull, heavy thud. The image was too much. He saw Michael's small, smiling face. He saw the tiny pine box he'd spent a week sanding until it was as smooth as silk. He sank onto the sofa, his head in his hands. The metal of the pry bar was still cold on his palm. Then what do we do, Ellie? What in God's name do we do? We're going to be on the street. They will put our things on the curb. Ellie was quiet for a long time. She coughed, a deep, rattling sound that terrified him, then recovered, pressing a handkerchief to her lips. She got up and walked over to the banker's boxes they'd brought back, the ones marked Orion Properties. "We didn't just find the case," she said, her voice practical again, pulling them both back from the brink. "We found his office. We found his life. Maybe the answer is in here." For the next 2 days, they lived on watered-down soup and crackers, and they sorted. The world outside was a blizzard of snow and final demand notices sliding under their door. Inside, their small apartment became an archive, the smell of mildew and old paper overpowering the smell of cabbage. The boxes were not junk. They were meticulous records. Stock certificates for companies Arthur had never heard of. Property deeds for vast parcels of land in Wyoming and Oregon. Binders full of what looked like bearer bonds, though Arthur couldn't be sure. They looked like old-fashioned, important money. We could take just one," Arthur whispered, holding a sheaf of bonds. "Who would know?" "We would," Ellie said, not looking up. She was sorting through a different box. "Oh, Arthur, look." In one box, tucked beneath a stack of old ledgers, was a single leather-bound album. It wasn't financials, it was a sketchbook. The drawings were architectural, precise. Designs for houses, for furniture, for a child's swing set with intricate carved animals. They were beautiful. Arthur, the failed carpenter, recognized the hand of a master. The man wasn't just a coder, he was a builder. He ran his fingers over a drawing for a complex dovetailed joint, a flicker of his old self, his old skill stirring in his chest. And in the back of the book, a single photograph fell out. A young, dark-eyed man, Julian Crest, holding a little girl with bright, fiery red hair. She was laughing, holding up a drawing of her own. On the back, in faint pencil, it read, "Lila, 1998. Our treehouse." Ellie held the photo to her chest. "She looks like my sister's girl," she whispered, her eyes filling. Arthur, meanwhile, had found something else. In a folder marked Personal, tucked into a false bottom of the box, he found a single, sealed envelope. It was not addressed to anyone. It was just thick, expensive cream-colored paper. He opened it, his rough fingers fumbling with the wax seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small, flat brass key, like a safe deposit key. The paper contained 2 things, a name and a phone number. Dr. Eris Thorne, San Francisco. There was no explanation, just the name and the number. "San Francisco," Arthur said. That's 1,000 miles away. Who calls a doctor in San Francisco?" "You do," Ellie said, looking up from the photo. "You have to call." "What do I say? Hello? I bought your missing billionaire's junk, and I have a box I'm not supposed to open? They'll think I'm a crank or a blackmailer." You say you found his property," Ellie said, her voice firm. "You say you're trying to return it." Arthur stared at their rotary phone, a beige plastic relic. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done. Harder than the funeral, harder than the bankruptcy. He picked up the receiver, his hands shaking, and dialed. He had to ask the operator for the area code. The phone rang 3 times. A woman's voice answered, professional and clipped. Dr. Thorne's office. I need to speak to Dr. Thorne, Arthur stammered. It's about Julian Crest. There was a dead, cold silence on the line. Arthur thought she'd hung up. He could hear his own heart pounding. Who is this? The voice was sharp, protective, suspicious. My name is Arthur Vance. My wife and we acquired a storage unit in Ohio belonging to a Mr. Crest. We found something, a case, an aluminum case, and this number. Another long, agonizing silence. He heard a sharp intake of breath. Then, Mr. Vance. Dr. Thorne she's a private palliative care physician. Where did you say you were calling from? Arthur told her. He told her about the auction, the unit, the box. He left out the eviction, the desperation, the $17.14. You have the aluminum case? The woman asked, her voice suddenly tight with an emotion Arthur couldn't place. Yes, it's right here, in my living room. Do not open it, the woman said, a sudden, fierce command. Do not sell it. Do not move it. Can you come to San Francisco? We will pay. We will pay for everything. Arthur looked at Ellie. She was pale, but her eyes were bright, urgent. She nodded. We can come, Arthur said, his voice trembling. There's one more thing, the woman said, and now her voice was thick, unsteady. Mr. Crest, he's alive, but he's dying. He has days. You need to come now. The world tilted. The problem, which had been an abstract financial puzzle, a moral quandary for the future, suddenly became a race against time, a matter of life and death. The woman, an assistant named Maria, wired the money for plane tickets. It appeared in their bank account an hour later, a sum so large it made Arthur feel sick. It was the first time Arthur had been on a plane in 30 years. Ellie, who had never flown, held his hand the entire way, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the impossible, solid-looking clouds below. They felt like impostors, 2 worn-out sparrows in a world of eagles, their single, battered suitcase in the hold. They landed in San Francisco and were met by a black car. The air was cool and smelled of salt, so different from the flat, frozen damp of home. The driver, a large man in a quiet suit, didn't speak. He just took their suitcase and led them to the car. They drove for an hour, out of the city, up the coast, along a winding road where the cliffs fell away to the raging deep blue of the Pacific. The facility was not a hospital. It was a house, a long, low-slung building of glass and redwood that seemed to grow organically from the rock. It was the most beautiful and most lonely place Arthur had ever seen. Maria, the woman from the phone, met them at the door. She was young, efficient, and had eyes that were red from crying. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice hushed. "This way. Dr. Thorne is waiting." Dr. Eris Thorne was in a study, a room with a whole wall of glass overlooking the ocean. She was an older woman with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and a face of profound, weary intelligence. She stood as they entered. "Mr. and Mrs. Vance," she said, "you've brought a miracle. We thought everything was lost." "We just brought what's his," Arthur said, feeling clumsy and old, twisting his tweed cap in his hands. "The case, it's still at our apartment. We didn't know. Is the rest of it—" "The rest of it?" Dr. Thorne asked, her eyes sharp. "The desk, the chairs, the binders," Arthur said. "We found binders, and a painting. We left them in the unit. We only had the truck for a day." This was a lie. He didn't want to admit he'd thought them worthless. Dr. Thorne's eyes widened. A painting? Binders? The Orion binders? We brought some of them," Ellie whispered, gesturing to the small carry-on bag Arthur had, which held the sketchbook and the file with the phone number. "We didn't have room for the rest. We thought the case was the binders, Dr. Thorne said, walking to her desk. She looked faint. Maria, get Mr. Larson. He's the estate lawyer. He thought the Orion files were lost, destroyed, liquidated by a rogue employee. She looked at Arthur. Mr. Vance, what you acquired wasn't junk. It was Julian's past, his entire core portfolio. He's been living off a trust, but his assets, he thought they were gone. A fired assistant, a lost key, a clerical error that cost him his legacy. He'd been trying to find those binders for 5 years. He wanted to liquidate them. For what? Arthur asked. For his daughter, to leave her everything. Dr. Thorne sat down, gesturing for them to take the chairs opposite her. They were fine leather, and Arthur sat on the very edge. Julian has ALS. He's been in decline for 8 years. He has days, maybe a week. He can no longer speak. He communicates with an eye-tracking monitor. But his mind is as sharp as it ever was. She paused, looking out at the ocean. He has been consumed by 2 things: finding his daughter Lila and protecting the time capsule. He asked me to be his executor, to find her and to make sure she received it in 2050, or upon his death, if she was found. He was so afraid she wouldn't be ready, that she'd be too young, or that her mother would interfere. 2050 was his fail-safe. And his daughter? Ellie asked, her voice barely audible. We found her, Dr. Thorne said. Thorne said, and a small, real smile touched her face. 3 weeks ago. She's 32. She's a teacher in London. She thought her father had abandoned her. She's flying in. She lands tomorrow. Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. Tomorrow. They had arrived at the exact, precipitous moment when the past and the future were colliding. He talks about the case, Dr. Thorne continued, her voice soft. He worries about it. He thought it was safe, in an industrial vault. The storage unit was just a mistake, a single unpaid bill from a forgotten account. He doesn't know it's gone. He thinks it's the one thing he has left to give her. It's in our living room, Arthur said, the absurdity, the enormity of it hitting him. This priceless thing, sitting on our floor. And the binders, Dr. Thorne said, her gaze steady. Mr. Vance, those binders, that painting, they're worth millions, tens of millions. The room went silent. The only sound was the distant crash of waves and the ticking of a beautiful, complex clock on the mantel. Millions. Ellie looked at Arthur. He saw in her eyes the same vision he had. Their small apartment, the specialist for her cough, a life without fear, a life where the ring of the phone didn't send a jolt of panic through him. They could go home. They could say nothing about the binders. They could call the lawyer, Mr. Larson, and what? Stake their claim? The law was on their side. Finders keepers. The auction was legal. They owned those tens of millions. He's asking for you, Dr. Thorne said, pulling them from the impossible, suffocating fantasy. For us? He wants to meet the people who found his number. Julian Crest was in a room that was more glass than wall, overlooking the endless sea. He was impossibly frail, a skeleton in a high-tech chair, a blanket pooled in his lap. His body was still, but his eyes were alive. Dark and fierce, they darted between Arthur, Ellie, and the computer screen beside him. A synthesized voice spoke, flat and robotic, as his eyes typed. You found my key. We found the envelope, Arthur said, his voice thick. He stepped forward, holding his cap. In a box of your drawings. They're beautiful drawings, Mr. Crest. The joinery on the treehouse, it's masterwork. Julian's eyes fixed on him, a flicker of surprise, of light. The cursor flew. "You are a builder." "I was," Arthur said, "a long time ago." "We also found the case," Ellie said, stepping forward. Her fear was gone, replaced by a simple, profound empathy. She saw not a millionaire, but a man trapped, a father waiting. "The one for your daughter, Leela." Julian's eyes squeezed shut. A single, difficult tear tracked down his paper-thin temple. The cursor moved again. "She is coming." "We know," Ellie whispered, reaching out and, for just a second, touching his hand. It was cold. "We know. And it's safe. The case is safe. We didn't open it." "Why?" The single word hung in the air. The cursor began to move again, slowly, painstakingly. "You are poor. I can see it. My lawyer says you own it. Why? Why didn't you? You're poor. You're desperate. Why?" Arthur looked at his hands, calloused and scarred from a life of work. He thought of Michael. He thought of the pine box. "Because we're parents," Arthur said, his voice quiet but steady, meeting the man's gaze. "We lost our son, Michael, 20 years ago. When we buried him, we buried a box with him. A little pine box I made. We put his favorite truck in it. A picture he drew. It was his. It was the last thing we could give him. A promise. Ellie's right. You don't open another man's heart. You just don't." The silence in the room was absolute. It was so quiet, Arthur could hear his own ragged breathing. Julian Crest stared at him, his dark eyes searching Arthur's face for a long, heavy minute. He typed, "You are a good man." "I'm just a man who understands," Arthur said. Just then, Ellie coughed. It wasn't her small, papery cough. It was a fit, a deep, racking, terrible sound that echoed in the glass room. She fumbled for her handkerchief, her face flushing, then going pale. Arthur rushed to her side, steadying her. Julian's eyes darted to her, filled with a sudden, sharp, almost angry concern. "Ellie, she's not well," Arthur said, the admission costing him everything. We've had some trouble." "Dr. Thorne told me," the voice said. "The auction. You paid $480 for my life." "We'll bring it all back," Arthur said quickly. "The case, the binders, the painting, everything. We'll rent a truck. We'll get it here, for your daughter, so she has it when she arrives." "Thank you," Julian typed. Then he looked at Dr. Thorne, who had been standing silently by the door. He typed something visible only to her. She read it, and her eyebrows shot up. She leaned down, whispering. He stared at her, typed again with fierce, slow precision. She nodded, her face unreadable. "Julian," she said, softly, "Lila's plane lands at 10 a.m. You should rest." She ushered Arthur and Ellie out. "We have rooms for you," she said. "You'll stay here tonight. Tomorrow, we'll arrange transport for the items." "We can't," Arthur said. We have to go back. We have to arrange for the desk to be picked up." "Mr. Vance," Dr. Thorne said, stopping him in the hall. "Julian is a very precise man. He is also, in his way, a very kind one. He's asked me to take care of your situation." "We don't want charity," Arthur said, his pride flaring. "We just wanted to do the right thing." "It's not charity," the doctor said, her voice firm. "It's an exchange, a transaction. You saved his legacy. The cost of that legacy." The binders, the painting, the desk is staggering. A finder's fee is standard. What he's offering is a fraction of what a court would award you if you fought the estate. He's a coder. He doesn't like loose ends. He wants to do this cleanly. As a thank you from one builder to another. She handed him an envelope. It was thick, heavy, from the estate lawyer's desk. Arthur's hand was shaking so hard he couldn't take it. He looked at it as if it were a snake. Ellie took it for him, her small, steady hand closing over the paper. "Thank you," she whispered. They spent the night in a room that was larger than their entire apartment, listening to the ocean. They didn't sleep. They just sat, side by side on the edge of a bed that felt too soft, watching the moon move across the water. They didn't open the envelope. They were afraid of what was inside, afraid it would be too much, or not enough. In the morning, the black car took them back to the airport. They flew home in a daze. The apartment, when they entered it, was cold and smelled of dust and their own quiet poverty. The eviction notice was still on the floor where it had fallen off the case, and the case was still there, silent, waiting. Arthur sat on the sofa. Ellie sat in the recliner. For a long time, neither spoke. Then, Ellie handed him the envelope. His hands were steady now. He opened it. Inside was a cashier's check. He looked at the numbers. He read them 3 times, his lips moving. He passed the check to Ellie. She burst into tears. It wasn't a wail. It was a quiet, exhausted, relieved sobbing that shook her entire frame. A sound of 20 years of terror finally leaving her body. It wasn't millions. Julian Crest was too precise for that. But it was enough. It was $300,000. It was enough to pay the rent. It was enough to pay the back utilities. It was enough to pay off the last of Michael's medical debt, the 20-year-old ghost that had haunted their credit and their lives. It was enough for Ellie to see a lung specialist, a real one, at the Cleveland Clinic. It was enough to buy their small, shabby apartment outright from the landlord. It was enough. 2 days later, a professional art transport team hired by Dr. Thorne arrived. They crated the painting, the desk, the ruined Eames chairs, and the binders from the storage unit, which Arthur had retrieved. They treated every object with a reverence that Arthur found startling. The team leader, a man with careful hands, paused by the desk. "Incredible piece," he said to Arthur. We're always looking for consultants, you know, people who know good wood, old-timers. Here's my card." Arthur took it. Last, they came for the case. 2 men in white gloves lifted it, placed it in a custom-built foam container, and sealed it. "Where is it going?" Ellie asked, her hand on Arthur's arm. "Back to the house, ma'am," the driver said. The family is waiting for it." And just like that, it was gone. The apartment felt suddenly impossibly empty and impossibly large. A week later, a small package arrived. It was from Dr. Thorne. Inside, there was a short note. He passed peacefully, holding her hand. He wanted you to have this. It was a simple, beautiful photograph. It was of Julian Crest, in his chair, looking at the ocean. Beside him sat a young woman with his dark eyes and her mother's fiery red hair. Her hand was in his. Her other hand was resting on the aluminum case, which was, finally, open. In the photo, they could see the contents. Stacks of letters, a child's drawings, a small bronze model of the treehouse from the sketchbook. They were both smiling. Ellie framed the picture and put it on the mantel, next to the last picture they had of Michael. Life went on. But it was different. The terror was gone. Ellie saw her specialist. It wasn't a miracle. Her lungs were scarred, but with new medicine, her cough subsided. The wheezing stopped. Color returned to her cheeks. Arthur paid off their debts, every last one. He bought the apartment. The landlord, stunned, took the check. For the first time in 2 decades, Arthur Vance was not a man drowning. He was just a man. One afternoon, he went to the bank, took out a small amount of cash, and went to a specialty lumber yard. He came back with 3 planks of bird's eye maple, the grain swirling like water. He went to his old steel toolbox. He opened it. He took out his hand plane, his chisels, his dovetail saw. His hands were still stiff, his knuckles gnarled, but the ache was just an ache, not a judgment. He cleared a space on their small dining table, covered it in a tarp, and began to work. The story ends not in a flash of wealth or in a grand gesture. It ends in the scrape of a tool against wood, a sound that was once Arthur's whole life. It ends with the scent of fresh-cut maple filling a small, quiet apartment, a scent that finally overpowered the smell of dust and boiled cabbage. Ellie sat in the recliner, reading a book from the library, breathing easy, the sound of her breath peaceful and clear. Arthur measured, marked, and made the first cut. He was building a new box, a small one with perfect joints, just to hold Ellie's sewing things. He wasn't a rich man. He wasn't a young man. But as the sun streamed in through the clean window, catching the fine, golden sawdust that danced in the air like a promise, Arthur Vance was a builder again. And he was, at last, at peace.